This isn't my story, not really. It's Jim's. And in telling his story, even with his permission and encouragement, I know I'm going to make mistakes. Why? Because I'm a suburban sort of person originally, and this is a rural sort of story mostly, and that means I'm not altogether clear on the names of things and how they work. I pointed this out to Jim just last week and asked if I could run a draft of the story by him. "Don't you worry about that," he said. "You just tell the story the way you saw it." So I have, and here it is. Jim makes a living by doing the sorts of jobs that need doing in a rural area. His dad was a farmer, but he lost the family farm somehow when Jim was still in his teens. Jim doesn't like to talk about that, and I've been careful to avoid asking about it. If things had gone differently, he'd be farming himself, I think, but as it is, he turns his hand to a number of things. In winter, he clears back roads and long driveways with his snowplow. In spring, he pumps out flooded basements with his portable pump. And in the summer and fall, he trundles down the old Smith Township road in his mobile crane, headed for construction sites of one kind or another. He's not a wealthy man, I know that for a fact, but he put food on his table and kept his children decently clothed, with a lot of help from his wife Tess, and saw them through college, too, the three that went. And he's famous in the village of Lakefield for the nativity scene he puts out on his front lawn at Christmas time. I've had the privilege of traveling a bit, and I've seen creches in a number of different countries. Time was that you'd see them set up in public spaces in western cities, but sensibilities have changed over the years, and now nativities are mostly found outside churches or on private front lawns like Jim's. I make no judgment about that. There are good arguments to be made on both sides, but I'm always quietly pleased when I see someone has taken the trouble to assemble or create a nice one. I like lights, too, and lots of people in Lakefield will take the kids for a drive into Peterborough just before Christmas to see the displays. Lights are fine, but I like nativity scenes best of all, and Jim's is famous for a good reason. It's big, and it's beautiful, and there's not another one like it in the 6 counties. Or it was famous, rather, and the shift in tenses launches us into the story. Every year for the last 30, Jim and Tess and their children, while they were still at home, hauled the familiar figures out of the old barn where they had lain wrapped in sacks for the past 49 weeks. There was a life-size Mary and Joseph, of course, and a baby Jesus in a manger, and these figures were carved, beautifully carved, by Jim himself. He had done a figure a year, he told me, just for the joy of working with wood at first. But when once he had carved Mary, Joseph, and the baby, he saw he had the makings of a splendid creche, and that began the tradition. The first year the figures had been exposed to the elements, but in the second year Jim constructed a portable stable and put it up around them, and every year thereafter he had added a new character, a new witness, a couple of shepherds, the 3 magi, and then some animals, a little donkey, some cows, a few sheep, a cocker-spaniel modelled on a beloved family pet. The scene had been finished years ago, and Jim was well into the maintenance stage, painting the figures, oiling them, making sure that time, which ravages us all, was foiled when it came to his family's nativity. Maybe you can foil time for a little while, but it's more difficult to protect against human wickedness. About a month ago, Jim woke up at 3:36 in the morning to the smell of fire. He roused Tess immediately, and they tumbled out of the house to see their nativity scene disappearing in the flames, literally going up in smoke. It was devastating, Tess said later. Jim was heartbroken, and so was she, and so were the children when they called them. So much of their family history was bound up somehow in that constellation of figures, that beautiful and reverent depiction of Christendom's first family. Nothing was saved, nothing could be salvaged, not a single figure, animal or human, nor even a wall of the stable. And the smell of gas, and a neighbor's report of a car squealing its tires as it raced off down Highway 29, made it clear that the creche had been set on fire deliberately. So what do you do? What do you do when someone takes your dream and tears it apart? What do you do when someone you don't even know, as seems most likely here, willfully and viciously destroys something you've invested years of your life in creating? What do you do when you realize you haven't the time or the energy or the will to start over again? Jim's response, and the response of his family, was, as I say, heartbreak. But heartbreak doesn't necessarily mean immobilization. Some people are paralyzed when things go desperately wrong. Jim and Tess couldn't afford to be. There were back roads and driveways to be ploughed still, and baking to be done, and gifts to be shopped for, and laundry and house cleaning, but you know what a family needs to do day in, day out, if life shoals are to be negotiated safely. Jim and Tess simply got on with it. If they had no other prompt, Tess said, there was the fact that their children and grandchildren would be coming on Christmas Eve and staying through Boxing Day. They had many friends, the Tyndales, and a number got up a bit of a subscription, as Ernie Crossley called it, and a few days after the fire we presented Jim and Tess with a cheque to allow them to buy something. We didn't stipulate what, something to replace the nativity scene, though everyone acknowledged that it couldn't really be replaced, that what was gone was irreplaceable. Jim and Tess deliberated for a day or two. Then Jim went into Peterborough and bought a big illuminated star fashioned out of wire and clear lights, and on the afternoon of December 21st he winched it up, if winched is the word I want, and it probably isn't, to the top of his crane, then angled the crane in such a way that the star was right over the old barn in which they had kept the carved figures between Decembers. And at 6 p.m. on the night of December 21st, Jim threw a switch, and the star lit up, and the village had something new to admire in the wintry landscape. No, it wasn't as fine as the creche, but it was pretty fine for all that. Just the fact of its height made it seem pretty special. So, on the night of Christmas Eve, Jim and Tess and their children and grandchildren took themselves to St. John the Baptist Church for the 11 o'clock service, and they were back and the youngsters put to bed by 12:30. Jim and Tess and their grown-up children and their spouses, those that had them, had an eggnog and a quiet chat, and Tess said there were some tears shed over the lost nativity. Then they all retired by 1:30ish, knowing that the kids would be up just a few hours later. And of course, that night, like the 3 nights preceding it, the star had been illuminated, and Jim decided to leave it on, this night of all nights, till the morning. Why? Because it was a cold walk out to the cab of the crane with the light switch, and because it was Christmas Eve night, and now indeed Christmas morning, and maybe because Jim is a sentimental fellow. Okay. So people fall asleep, 3 or 4 to a room, with 7 in the lounge, and the house shifts in the cold, and the men begin to snore, and maybe the women do too, but we don't mention that, and the children talk the assertive sleep talk of the dark hours. I didn't say you could, and I'll tell Mummy if you don't, and suddenly there's a knock at the door. A knock at the door at 3:36 in the morning. Now, Jim hasn't slept too well since his nativity scene was burned down, and when that knock comes, he's up and out of bed before any of the younger folk are fully conscious, and he's at the front door and opening it and stepping out onto his cold front step, slipperless, even as his 28-year-old son Dave, a fine strapping fellow, is calling out, "I'll get it, Dad," and shaking the eggnog and the travel fatigue out of his head while reaching for his housecoat. And who's on the front step? It's a little boy, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, and he's strangely dressed, though he doesn't look cold, Jim said later, and he says just one sentence, "Come and see," and he gestures toward the old barn, illuminated, as it is, by Jim and Tess's star. So Jim, and his son Dave, and Tess, and Dave's wife Martha, and the whole extended Tyndale family pull on their slippers, tie up their housecoats and dressing gowns, and make their way, the young and the old holding hands, to the barn. And there, in that old barn, in amongst the straw and the sacking, with ancient lawn-mowers and rusting grass rakes and shovels and a wheelbarrow and a road hockey goal in the background, there, as I say, in the old barn, there stands a beautiful young woman and a straight-backed, bearded young man, and nestled in an old laundry tub, its interior lined with old newspapers, is a tiny new baby, his blue-green-brown eyes reflecting, in miniature, the awestruck, wondering faces that gaze down into this unlikely cradle, in this the most unlikely birthplace in all the world. And so it happens. Early every Christmas morning, in every outbuilding where nearby hearts issue a welcome, all unknowing, to a night sky which has, even now, a star for every one of us. And so it happens, and so it always will happen, until that day when we cease to see through a glass darkly, and find ourselves, as we will, face to face with the Creator who made us all.